Now we move to Idriss Jebari, someone who I know because he for some time led the student committee of Brismas, and I would like to invite you also to consider becoming active in that group. It has been on occasion very, very lively, and that led to the creation of their own journal in which you are invited to publish the critical Middle East studies, and he is now also giving us a paper today under the title of Algeria, Nation Building and the Recovery of National Personality.
Today I'd like to talk to you about Algeria, which, lest we forget, is part of the Middle East and the Arab world, even though we don't tend to talk a lot about it. And it's a particularly interesting place with regard to the social ideological dynamics which play in it. So I'd like to start with a small paradox. Nick Harrison is a professor at King's College, and he recently published a chapter on the experience of two North African novelists. One of them is a famous Algerian novelist, Jebari, remembering colonial education and remembering it positively. But if you know Algerian history, you know that the policy of Arabization was so important from the independence in 1962 up to this day. Still today we're talking a lot about identitarian concerns. So this paradox of some people remembering positively supposedly denaturation and others calling for the liquidation of colonial legacies till today made me wonder about what national project was pushed forward, what were the social basis of ideology, and especially looking at intellectuals that I have dealt with in my doctoral thesis, but not on Algeria, and I'm particularly interested in the paradox of how social experience shapes afterwards the ideological projects or projections that intellectuals come with, especially after independence, when this country has to reimagine what it consists of and how to go forward. Do people borrow from their own experience and then put that into practice? Now, Algeria is a very specific country. In the Middle East, it was, I think, the only one with Palestine being a population colony. It housed a million Europeans, which was 10% of the population. Social structure were dislocated for 132 years. And then afterwards, they had to go through a very difficult war to secure their independence, and they came out of it with a hegemonic force that could lead the change, but also a tired society. And finally, when the state did come up with the national project, it put together some ideological notions which, in hindsight, we might find difficult to conciliate, such as the revolution and third worldism, and at the same time, Islamic recovery. And as the title of my paper indicates, I'm particularly interested in this notion of recovery in order to go forward. Temporarily speaking, that can be a bit difficult to conceptualize, but reading newspapers and other official narratives from the time, that didn't seem to be an issue whatsoever. So my claim here today, and this is a very starting project, is how have intellectuals processed their social and cultural experiences to devise nation-building programs? And especially in Algeria's case, how have Arabization campaigns been a way to address cultural colonial legacies? Since I'm unhappy with the way post-colonial literature deals with cultural history of the region, or how intellectual history neglects the producers of culture and thought production in the process, this is mostly a call for social history, but also a way to think about how do we develop tools and methods in order to combine the two elements and not have these analyses where we study the person who produces the ideas and we study the ideas, but there's very little interactivity on how one influences the other. And finally, the big purpose of this paper, my beginning hunch is to look at critical discourse as a form of social and cultural practice. It has repercussion on the place these individuals, how they project themselves in the community and how they envisage this community. So let's keep that in mind. And very briefly, I'll talk to you about two people today who I think share a number of characteristics which make them especially interesting for this discussion, but in general for study of Arab intellectuals. Mustafa al-Ashraf was born in 1917 and died in 2007. Ahmed Talib Ibrahimi was born in 1932. Both of these figures share an age range, but mostly lived through different stages of Algeria's history. So they grew up under colonialism, they both studied in Arabic and French schools, so they were bicultural. And interestingly enough, because of the fervor of nationalism, they occupied some positions with the nationalist struggle, which meant that even though they present themselves as intellectuals, they did play a political role. And I'm particularly interested in this in order to move away from intellectual speaking completely theoretically. And here we have two cases of people who have had a bearing on the ideas they pushed forward. So for example, Ahmed Talib Ibrahimi, who was trained as a medical doctor, was named, after a number of happy circumstances, Minister of Education in 1965, so 3 years after Algerian independence, until 1970. So right when this policy of Arabization was devised, which was essentially his. And Lasharaf wrote the essay which sums up Algerian culture the most in 1965, again 3 years after independence. But because of his political alliances, had to spend a lot of time exiled in South America as an ambassador. But he came back in 1976, so he had more critical distance. And these two offer really a total vision, amongst others, but I'm comparing them here, of Algerian culture on these avenues. So I've looked at what they've wrote on the topic, and three ideas which I'm going to cover today. First of all, the link between Arabization and national culture. Now, it's particularly interesting that Talib Ibrahimi, as Minister of Education, defended what I would claim was very similar to the state line. So basically, he was arguing that, and I quote, our culture, these are my translations, by the way, our culture, which means first and foremost our education, should be Algerian, based on Arabic language that is profoundly rooted in society, while remaining largely open to foreign cultures, end quote. So Algeria's cultural policy consisted of a return to the Arabic and Islamic legacy which had been oppressed by French colonial forces. But it remained there, and it just had to be freed up and applied again. So Algerian culture preserved itself in symbols, proverbs, oral culture, and went into hibernation. So the Algerians could mobilize this rich past simply by turning their back on French and having Arabic school, and then opening the door for the future. On the other hand, Lasharaf was very critical of the aims of Arabization from very early on, when nationalist fervor was still very strong, and it was a very risky position to take. And mostly he did so by demystifying the symbolism that went around Arabic language, by saying that true, French policy did denature and undermine Arabic by destroying schools across Algeria very early on, but he also finds source of cultural decadence that predated colonialism. So he introduces this historical approach, and secondly by saying that classical Arabic was also the language of an aristocracy, and then the majority of the people spoke their own everyday language, and therefore he refutes the argument that Algeria's decadence was simply caused by French denaturation. Now, the second axis of my reading of what they wrote on the topic is their approach to these Arabization policies, so really the nitty-gritty aspect of policy in the 60s and the 70s. Talib Ibrahimi was the minister, so he can't obviously critique what he does himself. But because he was an intellectual and he was a non-conventional politician, he adopted some lucid criticism of the tasks that were faced by Algeria. And the biggest one, I would say, was pragmatic, and how to have enough teachers in order to simultaneously extend education for everybody, which is a universal right, and do so in Arabic. So they realized that however much they would like to hire Syrians and Egyptians to come and fill this gap, they still have to turn to France and ask for cultural cooperation for them to send them, because after all, the aim of modernization trumps the aim of cultural unification along these very ideal aims. However, he did so without refuting the argument that Arabic was unsuitable for modernity. And he, in his essay, he argues that he cites the case of Japan or how medicine is taught in Cairo or Syria by saying that Arabic can be the future of and modernity in Algeria. Lasharaf, on the other hand, criticizes fundamentally this Arabic they came up with in 1962 by saying it's unexpected that after centuries of not using this language for science and so on, that it would be simply ready for usage in 1962 for the modern challenges of life. So he said the priority is first and foremost to modernize this language rather than simply focus again on the Teutonization. And he criticized what he believes is the influence of Qawmiyun, so the Algerians who were formed in the Mashriq, in the east, and came with their very simplistic notion of nationalism and identity. The third and final axis is really shifting the debate away from language and policies in themselves and looking at Algerian society. And here we see a clear distinction between the two authors because of their social position. Lasharaf says, we talk about the Algerian nation and how it was oppressed under French colonialism, but who was really oppressed was Algerian society. He introduces this division between the two, and by saying that one of the current issues we have is we're coming out with a dislocated and broken apart society that we have to rebuild and reestablish. And the challenge is there's so much to do in 1962 or 65 for Algeria that stages have to be jumped. And for these stages to be jumped, we need to develop a very strategic approach to what national identity is, which means often letting go of some things that are part of our cultural legacy and simply being very efficient in order to achieve the ultimate aim, which is scientific progress. And that is, for him, the meaning of the Cultural Revolution. Talib Brahimi did introduce some social dynamics by saying that the policy had democratizing aims and it sought to introduce a new, it doesn't translate very well in English, but mentality, so collective representations, and how these new individuals were emerged and it wouldn't be an unequal society in the colonial era. However, there was, in my opinion, something profoundly lacking of his understanding of social dynamics and how education feeds into those. So that allows me to reach my preliminary conclusion, which is by the 70s or the late 70s, the debate had changed somewhat. It wasn't about recovering something or agreeing on what would constitute the elements that would allow us to go forward, but intellectuals were realizing the state was going on its way and they had to be constructive and support the dynamic rather than be critical for the sake of it. And Lasharaf tones his criticism down. For intellectuals, there's a social tension that is inherent with this shift of discourse, how to remain critical and efficient and constructive the way they imagined it, but also contribute to reforming these elements and supporting the quest for modernization. Talib Brahimi, from his social and political position occupying these different ministries, had less of a margin of maneuver to develop a conduct which brought these two imperatives together. Lasharaf was freer in that regard. But there's another element that emerges from this reading, that there's a profound lack of self-criticism that emerges from a generation that define themselves as critical intellectuals. And I make this claim on the basis of other intellectuals I've compared with in Morocco and Tunisia, which share a lot of social and political common elements. This debate on the recovery of Algerian personality cannot be solely explained by the social determinants that I've just evoked. There is something in the word itself that was powerful and evocative and founded the national project, which is why I've turned to the specificity of the Algerian experience, coming out of decades for these people of oppressive colonialism, left marks on how the stakes of the ideological debate. And here, There's a generation constituted of Malik bin Nabi, Abdullah Mazouni, and others who share these elements of the lack of self-criticism in these identitarian debates. Secondly, of course, we need to look at this in terms of a generation and a specific intelligentsia sharing socio-political aspects. To finish, I'd like to quote Fanny Colonna, who's as informed an observer as there could be of these Algerian dynamics, who notes this constant element of self-defense in Algerian critical writing and this lack of self-criticism. And she explains that to properly understand this intellectual generation, you have to understand that they have defended themselves constantly, and therefore it institutes a notion of not wanting to give others the tools to attack them. However, I think it's also a missed opportunity to establish a post-ideological debate, as we started to see after 1967 in the Arab world and in the region itself, and develop a next stage for Algeria's cultural unification. Thank you.
Thank you very much.